autumn of 1693, a small sloop with 60 men and 12 cannons sailed into the Red Sea. She was called the Amity. She was a modest vessel by any standard of the age, not impressive in her armament, not remarkable in her size. Her crew had originally been commissioned by two Bermuda merchants to raid a French trading post in West Africa, a commission that had collapsed before it started, when bad weather separated the Amity from her partner vessel and left her captain making a decision in the open ocean that would change the history of piracy forever. The captain's name was Thomas Tew. He was approximately 44 years old. He had been a privateer, operating under government commission for years. He had never been particularly rich. He had never been particularly famous. He was, by any reasonable assessment of his career to that point, a capable but unremarkable maritime operator in the colonial world of the late 17th century. He called his crew together on the deck of the Amity and told them that their original commission was worthless. The French trading post in West Africa was not something they could attack alone without their missing partner vessel. They had a choice. They could return to Bermuda and report failure, or they could do something else. He told them he knew where the money was. He had thought about it carefully. The Indian Ocean trade routes, the Mughal Empire's commercial shipping, the convoys that carried the wealth of the most powerful empire in Asia through waters that no European navy adequately protected. These were the targets that made the Caribbean look like small change. He pointed east. He said, "I am going to take a merry life, and a short one." His crew voted unanimously to follow him. 3 months later, the Amity intercepted a large Indian merchant vessel carrying 300 armed soldiers as escort. The soldiers looked at the Amity and her 60 men and made a calculation. They surrendered without firing a single shot. The cargo of that Indian ship was 100,000 pounds in gold and silver alone, not counting the ivory, spices, gemstones, and silk that filled the holds. Each of Thomas Tew's 60 crew members received between 1,200 and 3,000 pounds as their individual share. Thomas Tew himself received 8,000 pounds. In an era when a skilled English worker might earn 20 or 30 pounds in an entire year, each ordinary sailor on the Amity had just been paid the equivalent of 40 to 100 years of wages in a single afternoon. Tew sailed home to Rhode Island. He repaid his investors at 14 times their original investment. He sat in the parlor of the governor of New York and drank wine and told stories about the Red Sea. And every pirate in the Atlantic world heard what Thomas Tew had done. And every pirate in the Atlantic world began looking at a map and tracing the route from their current position to the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Tears at the mouth of the Red Sea where the money was. Thomas Tew had invented the pirate round, and the pirate round would produce Henry Every's raid on the Ganges Sawai, the greatest single act of piracy in recorded history. It would draw William Kidd to his destruction. It would inspire every major pirate operation in the Indian Ocean for the next 2 decades. One decision, one vote on the deck of a small sloop in the Atlantic, one man pointing east and saying, "Follow me." It changed the world of piracy forever. This is the story of Thomas Tew, the Rhode Island pirate, the man who opened the door to the Indian Ocean and made the fortunes and the graves of every pirate who followed him through it. Thomas Tew's family had been in New England since 1640, when his relatives settled in Rhode Island as part of the wave of Puritan and dissenting emigration that was filling the colonies with people who had found England inhospitable for one reason or another. The specific details of Tew's own birth are uncertain. Some sources suggest he was born around 1649, possibly in England before the family emigrated, possibly in Rhode Island after they arrived. The documentary record of his early life is thin in the way that the early lives of men who were not famous until late are always thin. What is clear is that by the late 1680s and early 1690s, Thomas Tew was a maritime operator based in Bermuda, the small British island colony in the western Atlantic that served as a staging point for privateering operations and Atlantic trade. He had moved there from Rhode Island at some point, following the economic opportunities that Bermuda offered to men with maritime skills and a tolerance for the legal ambiguities of privateer operations. Bermuda in the 1690s was a place where the line between legitimate privateering and outright piracy was regularly blurred by men who operated under commission from colonial governors, who asked limited questions about exactly what their commissioned captains were doing. The colonial economy of the island depended significantly on the money that came back with these operations, and the governors who issued the commissions had a financial interest in not examining too carefully the methods by which their privateers generated income. Tew fits this world perfectly. He was experienced. He was known. He had the kind of reputation that allowed him to attract investors and crew for ventures that required trust in the competence and reliability of the man leading them. He was not a large-scale operator in the way that Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts would later be large-scale operators. He was a capable professional in the middle tier of the colonial maritime world, working within the existing system of privateer commissions and colonial commerce. In 1692, he obtained letters of marque from the governor of Bermuda, documentation that authorized him to conduct military operations against French interests in West Africa. This was a legitimate privateering commission, the kind of authorization that gave legal cover to what would otherwise be piracy. 2 Bermuda merchants funded the venture, providing money for the Amity's equipment, provisions, and crew. The plan was straightforward. The Amity and a partner sloop would sail to the coast of West Africa and attack a French trading post at the mouth of the Gambia River. It was not an enormously ambitious operation by the standards of the period, but it was a viable one, with a clear target and a reasonable prospect of profit. Then a storm hit. Somewhere in the Atlantic, on the voyage south, the Amity and her partner ship were separated by bad weather. Tew searched for the missing vessel and could not find her. He was now alone in the Atlantic, with 60 men, 12 cannons, and a commission to attack a French trading post that he could not safely attack without the backup his partner was supposed to provide. This is the moment where Thomas Tew's story diverges from the stories of 1,000 other colonial privateers who found themselves in similar situations and turned around and went home. Most men in that position would have made the rational calculation. The commission was no longer executable. Return to Bermuda, report what happened, collect whatever the investors were willing to pay for the effort, and try again another time. Tew did not make the rational calculation. He made a different one. He had been in the colonial maritime world long enough to know things that most of his contemporaries also knew, but had not yet acted on. The Indian Ocean was rich in ways that the Caribbean was not. The Mughal Empire controlled the most lucrative trade routes in Asia. The convoys that carried the accumulated wealth of India, Persia, and the Arabian trade back and forth through the Red Sea were not adequately protected by any military force. The European nations with interests in the region, primarily England through the East India Company, had their own commercial reasons for not aggressively policing the waters in ways that would have disrupted the trade they depended on. The pirates of the Caribbean were fighting over merchant ships with cargoes measured in hundreds of pounds. The ships in the Red Sea were carrying cargoes measured in tens of thousands, in some cases, hundreds of thousands. Tu called his crew together and told them the truth about their situation and what he proposed to do about it. He told them the original commission was effectively dead. He told them they could go home with nothing to show for the voyage. And then he told them where the real money was. The pirate round was the route from the Atlantic around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, up through the Mozambique Channel between the African mainland and Madagascar, and into the Indian Ocean. From there, a ship could reach the mouth of the Red Sea at the Bab el-Mandeb, the narrow strait through which virtually all traffic between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea passed. A ship positioned at the Bab el-Mandeb was positioned at the choke point of the most valuable trade route in the world. Tu proposed to take the Amity to that choke point and wait. The crew voted. The vote was unanimous. They turned east. The voyage to the Red Sea from the Atlantic required sailing around the entire southern coast of Africa, a journey of thousands of miles through waters that ranged from difficult to genuinely dangerous. The Cape of Good Hope was called the Cape of Storms for good reason. The Southern Ocean, south of Africa, was one of the most brutal sailing environments on the planet, with swells that could reach 60 feet and winds that could strip sails from masts. Ships were lost there regularly. Tu navigated it. He brought the Amity around the Cape and north through the Mozambique Channel, stopping at Madagascar to provision and rest. Madagascar at this period was not yet the established pirate base it would become in the following decade, but it had some of the characteristics that would make it useful for that purpose. It was remote from any effective European colonial authority. Its coastal communities were willing to trade for the goods that pirates brought, and its harbors offered shelter and fresh water and food. Adam Baldridge was already on Madagascar when Tu arrived. Baldridge was an ex-pirate who had established himself as a trader and provisioner on the island of Sainte Marie off Madagascar's east coast, building a small but functional settlement that would become the primary resupply point for pirates operating the pirate round in the years that followed. He traded with the passing ships, providing them with what they needed, and he traded with the local Malagasy communities, building the network of relationships that allowed him to operate in relative safety. Tu stopped at Baldridge's settlement, careened the Amity, scraping her hull clean of the marine growth that accumulated and reduced a ship's speed, took on provisions, and continued north. By late 1693, the Amity was in position at the Bab el-Mandeb. The strait was approximately 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. Everything moving between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean passed through it. Pilgrim ships returning from Mecca, merchant vessels laden with spices and silk and ivory, trade dhows carrying the commerce of the Indian Ocean coastal communities, and occasional convoy ships guarding particularly valuable cargoes. Tu waited. A large ganja appeared. A ganja was a type of large Arab dhow, a traditional sailing vessel of the Indian Ocean, and this one was moving from India to the Ottoman Empire with a substantial cargo and a military escort of 300 soldiers. 300 soldiers on one ship against 60 pirates on another. By every rational military calculation, the defenders had an overwhelming advantage. They had 5 times as many fighters. They presumably had weapons. They had the specific defensive advantage of fighting aboard a ship they knew, against attackers who were trying to board a vessel in the open sea. Tu ordered the attack. What happened next defines something essential about piracy in the late 17th century that the romantic image of the pirate as fearless adventurer sometimes obscures. The 300 soldiers on that ganja looked at the Amity approaching and made a collective decision that had nothing to do with courage or cowardice in the conventional sense. They surrendered without firing a shot. Not one casualty, not one exchange of fire. 300 armed men who could, by any mathematical reckoning of the engagement, have repelled 60 attackers, chose instead to put down their weapons and let the pirates take the ship. The historical record does not fully explain this. The most plausible interpretation involves the specific economics of the decision these men were making. They were soldiers serving a commercial enterprise, not defenders of a homeland or a faith. They were being paid to escort a cargo ship, not to die for it. Their employers had calculated that the cost of the military escort was worth paying for the protection it provided. The escort's calculation, when confronted with a pirate ship attacking with obvious determination, may simply have been that their contract did not require them to die, and that surrendering was a reasonable interpretation of their obligations. Whatever the reasoning, the result was that Tew and his 60 men took a ship guarded by 300 soldiers without any of them getting hurt. The cargo they found was extraordinary: 100,000 pounds in gold and silver. This was the documented minimum, confirmed by multiple sources. On top of that, ivory, which was among the most valuable luxury goods in the European and Asian markets of the period, spices, gemstones, silk. The accumulated luxury cargo of the Indian Ocean trade, the goods that the European market paid enormous premiums for, sitting in the hold of a ship that had just surrendered without a fight. 100,000 pounds in gold and silver alone. Tew's investors in Bermuda had put up a relatively modest sum to fund the voyage. When he returned and settled accounts, they received 14 times their investment back. The 14-fold return is one of the most remarkable single investment results in the history of the colonial maritime world. It is also the number that, when it circulated through the colonial ports of the Atlantic seaboard, transformed Thomas Tew from a capable privateer captain into a legend, and transformed the pirate round from Tew's personal innovation into the defining strategy of an entire generation of pirates. Thomas Tew arrived back in Newport, Rhode Island, in April of 1694. His arrival was not the skulking return of a criminal trying to avoid notice. It was closer to a triumphal entry. He came back with money, real money, the kind of money that changed a man's social position permanently, the kind of money that opened doors that birth and circumstances had kept closed. Newport in 1694 was one of the more prosperous ports in the American colonies, a city built on maritime trade and on the specific tolerance for commercial ambiguity that characterized colonial New England's relationship with the law. The people of Newport knew where money came from, and they knew that asking too many questions about its origins was not good for business. Tew brought money. Newport welcomed him. He bought a house. He furnished it. He entertained. He became, within weeks of his return, a recognized figure in the social world of Newport, a man whose success was admired and whose table was sought. The specific mechanism by which a pirate captain who had just committed multiple acts of robbery on the other side of the world became a celebrated member of colonial Rhode Island society tells you something important about the moral economy of the Atlantic world in the 1690s. The East India Company hated it. The East India Company was the primary English commercial interest in the Indian Ocean trade, and it depended on the reliability of trade routes that pirates like Tew were disrupting. When the company's representatives in England heard what Tew had done, where he had done it, and how he had been received on his return, they were furious. They petitioned the English government to take action. They demanded that colonial governors crack down on piracy generally and on the specific men who were enriching themselves at the expense of the company's relationships with the Mughal Empire. The colonial governors were not uniformly enthusiastic about this demand. Benjamin Fletcher, the royal governor of the province of New York, was one of the most prominent examples of a colonial official whose relationship with pirates was, to put it charitably, complex. Fletcher received two in New York with the hospitality that one prosperous gentleman showed to another. He dined with him. He spoke with him. He found Two an intelligent and engaging man whose company he genuinely enjoyed. He also appears to have found Two's money useful in the way that corrupt colonial officials have always found the money of men operating outside the law useful. The relationship between Fletcher and Two was investigated by English authorities after the fact and was found to reflect the broader problem of colonial governors who profited from the piracy they were supposed to suppress. Fletcher was eventually removed from his position as governor, partly because of his associations with pirates, of whom Two was the most prominent. But in 1694, Fletcher was still in power, and Two was still welcome at his table, and the conversations they had over dinner in New York represented a specific kind of corruption that was structural rather than individual. The colonial system created officials who were simultaneously responsible for enforcing English commercial law and dependent on the economic activity generated by men who violated it. The result was predictable and consistent. The law was enforced selectively against men who could not pay to have it ignored, and the men who could pay were invited to dinner. Two paid. He was invited to dinner. He also acquired, through Fletcher, a new commission for a second voyage. The commission cost him £300, paid directly to Fletcher, and it authorized Two to operate as a privateer against enemies of England in the Indian Ocean. The commission was not an authorization to commit piracy. It was a piece of paper that Two could show if challenged, that could be interpreted to cover the activities he intended to conduct, and that cost £300. He had made £8,000 on the first voyage. £300 for legal cover for the second voyage was a reasonable investment. In November of 1694, less than 8 months after returning from the first voyage, Thomas Two departed New York for the Indian Ocean again. The second voyage was larger than the first, in every sense. Two left with more men and the experience of having done the journey once. He had learned what the route required, where the provisioning stops were, how long each leg took, where the best positions to intercept traffic were. The knowledge he had accumulated on the first voyage was itself a form of capital, and he invested it in the planning for the second. More significantly, the word had spread. When Two reached Madagascar on the second voyage, he was no longer alone. Other captains with their own vessels were in those waters, drawn by the same information about the pirate round that Two's success had generated. Some of them had followed his specific route. Some had arrived by different paths, but with the same destination in mind. They gathered at Baldridge's settlement at St. Marie, and they talked about what came next. The names that would join Two's fleet for the second Indian Ocean operation read like a roster of the early pirate round. Henry Every, who was sailing the Fancy, and who would go on to conduct the greatest single act of piracy in recorded history. Joseph Farrow, Thomas Wake, William May, Richard Want. Every was the most significant figure in this constellation. He was sailing a larger, better-armed vessel than any of the others, the Fancy, which he had captured earlier in his voyage, and which was among the fastest ships in the Indian Ocean. He was, by every subsequent account, a man of exceptional tactical intelligence and organizational capability. When the various captains assembled at Madagascar decided to operate as a coordinated fleet, Every was elected admiral. Two was part of this fleet. He had helped create the conditions that made it possible, by demonstrating on the first voyage that the pirate round worked and that the prizes were real. But for the second voyage, he was operating alongside men who were in some cases more capable than he was, with ships that in some cases were more powerful than the Amity. The fleet sailed north toward the Bab el-Mandeb in the late summer of 1695. The intelligence they were working with was specific and credible. A Mughal convoy of 25 ships was returning from the pilgrimage to Mecca. The convoy was carrying an extraordinary cargo, including the personal treasure ship of the Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb himself, the Ganj-e-Sawai, whose name translated as exceeding treasure, and whose cargo was rumored to be in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. 25 ships, a fortune that dwarfed anything two had taken on the first voyage, and the Bab el-Mandeb to pass through. On the night of August or early September of 1695, the Mughal convoy passed through the strait. In the darkness, the fleet slipped past the waiting pirates without being engaged. The 25 ships moved quietly through the narrow water and emerged into the Gulf of Aden before the pirate fleet could organize a coordinated response. The prize that every pirate in the fleet had come halfway around the world to take had passed them in the night. The fleet gave chase. The Fancy, Henry Every's ship, was the fastest vessel in the pirate fleet, and she drove hard after the dispersing convoy. She caught ships, she engaged ships, but the Amity could not keep pace with the Fancy. Two's vessel was falling behind. A single Mughal ship had also fallen behind the main convoy, unable to keep up with the rest. The Fateh Muhammad, a large vessel that was part of the convoy's escort structure, was lagging. She was not the Ganj-e-Sawai. She was not the great prize that every captain in the fleet had crossed an ocean to take. But she was a Mughal ship with a cargo, and she was within reach. Tew ordered the Amity to engage her. The battle that killed Thomas Tew was by any measure a mismatch that should have ended in his favor. The Amity had chased down a ship that was separated from the convoy, weakened, struggling. Tew had 60 men and 12 cannons, and the experience of a successful Red Sea campaign behind him. The Fateh Muhammad was carrying cargo and some soldiers, but had lost the protection of the convoy. An experienced pirate captain in a position like this should have been able to take the ship with limited casualties. Should have been. What happened instead was one of the most sudden and brutal endings in the history of Golden Age piracy. The accounts vary in their specifics, as accounts of battles always do when they are filtered through the testimony of survivors and the narratives of later historians. But the core of what happened is consistent across multiple sources. Tew led the boarding action personally, as was expected of a captain of his era. The Amity came alongside the Fateh Muhammad, and Tew's men began the assault. A Mughal cannon fired. The cannonball found Thomas Tew. The accounts describe what happened in terms that are uniformly graphic, because the injury was of a kind that does not permit euphemism. The ball struck him in the abdomen. It disemboweled him. The man who had invented the pirate round, who had taken 100,000 pounds in gold and silver from the Red Sea with 60 men and 12 cannons, who had dined with the governor of New York and repaid his investors at 14 times their money, was holding his own intestines in his hands on the deck of the Amity. He died within moments. Captain Johnson's General History of the Pirates, which preserved this account for posterity with the specific dramatic clarity that Johnson brought to his subject, wrote that Tew's men were so discouraged by the loss of their commander that they yielded without further resistance. They had watched the man who had told them to follow him and delivered on every promise he made. The man who had said, "Merry life and a short one," and had meant both parts, die in the space of seconds in front of them. The fight went out of them completely. They surrendered. They remained prisoners aboard the Fateh Muhammad until Henry Every, who had by this point caught and engaged the Ganj-e-Sawai, and was in the process of conducting the greatest pirate raid in history, returned and freed them. Thomas Tew was dead. His body was somewhere on the Amity's deck or in the waters of the Arabian Sea. His burial site is unknown. There is no grave for the man who opened the Indian Ocean to piracy. The Amity eventually made it back to Baldridge's settlement in Madagascar under new command and was eventually traded for another ship. She continued in various hands for some time after her captain's death, as ships do, carrying the purposes of whoever owned her rather than those of the man who had taken her to the Red Sea and back. Tew left no confirmed grave. He left no confirmed portrait. He left no descendants that history has confirmed, though one persistent legend claims that he fathered a son with a Malagasy woman during his voyages to Madagascar, and that this son eventually became Ratsimilaho, a man who built an actual kingdom on the east coast of Madagascar and who ruled it for decades. The identification cannot be confirmed, but it has a specific resonance as a legacy for Thomas Tew, that the man who never quite achieved the permanent wealth and power he was seeking might have left behind an heir who achieved both, in a form Tew himself could never have imagined. The legacy of Thomas Tew has two distinct dimensions, and both of them are worth examining carefully because they tell different things about what he actually accomplished. The first dimension is the direct one, the pirate round. Before Tew's first voyage in 1693, the Indian Ocean was not a significant target for English and colonial American pirates. The Caribbean was the familiar hunting ground, and while the prizes there were real, they were limited. The great commercial wealth of the world in the late 17th century moved not through the Caribbean, but through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. The Mughal Empire's trade, the Persian Gulf commerce, the goods that connected the Indian subcontinent to the markets of the Ottoman world and eventually to Europe, all of it moved through waters that no pirate had systematically targeted. Tew went there. He found what he expected to find. He came home with the proof. The proof was the 14-fold return for his investors and the 3,000 pounds that each of his 60 ordinary crew members received. Numbers like that, circulating through the colonial ports of the Atlantic seaboard, were not abstract. They were the specific content of conversations in taverns, in ships' cabins, and counting houses from Newport to Bermuda to New York. Men who heard those numbers, and who had the maritime skills to make the voyage, did the obvious calculation. Henry Every made the voyage. He conducted the raid on the Ganges Sawai in 1695, taking what contemporary estimates placed between 300,000 and 600,000 pounds, the single greatest act of piracy in the history of the Golden Age, and he was in those waters because Thomas Tew had demonstrated the route was viable. William Kidd was specifically commissioned, in part, to hunt down Thomas Tew and the other pirates who were following the pirate round. Kidd's commission from a consortium of powerful English investors and officials named Tew by name as one of the pirates he was supposed to suppress. The political and commercial crisis created by the pirate round, the pressure it put on England's relationship with the Mughal Empire, the damage it did to the East India Company's operations, all of it traced back to Tew's first voyage. Kidd was sent to end what Tew had started. He failed and was hanged for it. The second dimension of Tew's legacy is less documented and more uncomfortable. The cargo that Tew took from that Indian dhow in the Red Sea in 1693, the 100,000 pounds in gold and silver and ivory and spice and gemstone and silk, belonged to someone. The 300 soldiers who surrendered without firing a shot were employed by merchants whose goods were on that ship. Goods that represented not just commercial value, but the livelihoods, and in some cases the survival of businesses, families, communities that depended on the proceeds of that trade. The historical record of Tew's raid is almost entirely told from the pirate perspective, because the historical record of the golden age of piracy in the English language was created primarily by English writers for English audiences who were more interested in the pirates than in their victims. Captain Johnson's General History, which is the primary source for most of what we know about too, was a bestseller in England, partly because it told dramatic stories that English readers found exciting, and the people on the other side of those stories, the merchants and sailors and soldiers of the Indian Ocean world, appear in it mostly as the setting for the pirates' adventures, rather than as people with their own histories and losses. What the historical record does preserve, in the diplomatic communications between the Mughal court and the English government and the East India Company after Henry Every's raid on the Ganges Sawai, is the anger of a civilization that had been robbed by men operating with apparent English government support, and that held England responsible for what had been done. Too's raid in 1693 was smaller than Every's in 1695, and the diplomatic consequences of Too's raid were less severe, but the pattern was the same. Pirates operating from English colonial bases on routes that Too had pioneered were taking Mughal ships in Indian Ocean waters. The Mughal Empire, which had every reason to view this as a policy of the English government rather than the independent actions of criminals, responded accordingly. The East India Company paid the price. The company's trading posts were seized. Its employees were arrested. Compensation was demanded and eventually paid. The commercial relationships that had taken generations to build were damaged in ways that took years to repair. This is the other side of Thomas Too's legacy. The route he opened produced enormous wealth for the men who sailed it. It also produced a diplomatic and commercial crisis that cost the English government and the East India Company far more than any individual pirate fortune. The pirate round was brilliant for the pirates and disastrous for everyone else who was involved in the Indian Ocean trade, including the English commercial interests that the colonial governors who welcomed Too home were nominally supposed to protect. The speech that Captain Johnson attributed to Thomas Too before the attack on the Mughal dhow in 1693 may or may not be precisely accurate. Johnson was writing 30 years after the events he described, and he had a gift for the kind of dialogue that made his subjects vivid and human, even when he was working from incomplete sources. But the words Johnson put in Too's mouth have the ring of something real, or at least something that reflects a real attitude that Too and men like him held. Too supposedly said, before ordering the attack, "I am going to take a merry life and a short one." This is the motto that has been attached to him ever since. It captures something true about the specific trade-off that men who took the pirate round were making. The merry life was real. The money was real. The freedom from the ordinary constraints of colonial life. The freedom to sail where you chose and take what you found and drink and celebrate and live without the specific grinding poverty that the colonial maritime world offered its ordinary sailors was real. The short life was also real. Too died at 46, disemboweled by a cannonball in the Arabian Sea, far from the Rhode Island he had sailed out of, far from the governor's table in New York, far from the house and the money and the social position that the first voyage had seemed to make permanent. 2 voyages. The first one was everything he had promised himself. The second one was the cannonball. Merry life and a short one. He meant it when he said it. The Amity's route from Rhode Island to the Red Sea and back was approximately 24,000 miles. Too made it twice, which means he sailed roughly 48,000 miles on the 2 voyages combined. In a small sloop, in the conditions of the late 17th century, with 12 cannons and 60 men and no naval support, and no government backing beyond a piece of paper that a corrupt colonial governor had sold him for £300. 48,000 miles in the Amity. The first voyage produced £100,000 in gold and silver and goods of comparable value. The second voyage produced a cannonball. This is the entire inventory of Thomas Tew's career. 2 voyages, 1 fortune, 1 death. But the route he pioneered outlasted him by decades. The pirate round continued after Tew was gone. Henry Every was on the route when Tew died. The men who had been Tew's crew continued sailing after the Amity changed hands. Other captains, drawn by the same information about the Red Sea that had drawn Tew, made the voyage and found the same ships and the same money and the same risks. William Kidd was commissioned specifically to stop them, specifically because what Tew had started could not be stopped by anything short of a formal naval operation. Kidd failed. He was hanged. The pirate round continued until the political and military pressure from the Mughal Empire and the East India Company and the English government eventually made the Indian Ocean genuinely dangerous for pirates in ways that the Caribbean had become dangerous earlier. By approximately 1700, the route was declining, though it did not entirely end for another decade or more. Thomas Tew started it in 1693 and was killed in 1695 before he could fully enjoy what he had built. In 2 years, he opened a trade route for crime that shaped the history of the Indian Ocean and the British colonial world for a generation. His grave is unknown. His route is not. There is one more piece of this story that deserves attention because it illuminates something about the world that Thomas Tew lived in and the world he helped create. When Tew returned to Newport in 1694 with his fortune, the East India Company was already complaining to the English government about pirates on the pirate round. The political pressure was building, but the colonial governors of the American colonies, men like Benjamin Fletcher of New York, were doing more than simply ignoring the pressure. They were actively profiting from the situation. Fletcher sold Tew his commission for the second voyage for £300. He entertained Tew socially, providing him with the respectability that a criminal needed in a society where reputation still mattered for practical reasons. He provided cover, social and legal, for a man whose activities were undermining the commercial relationships that the English government depended on for revenue and political stability. This was not unique to Fletcher. Multiple colonial governors in the American colonies and the Bahamas were doing similar things with similar pirates. The system that was supposed to suppress piracy was itself corrupted by the money that piracy generated. And the corruption ran high enough in the colonial hierarchy that cleaning it up required removing governors, which the English government eventually did. Fletcher was removed from office in 1698, partly because of his associations with pirates, partly because of broader corruption. The replacement governors brought instructions to suppress piracy more effectively, and the suppression eventually succeeded, at enormous cost in diplomacy and military effort, and the legal destruction of men like William Kidd, who were caught in the gap between what the government wanted done and what the system it had built made it possible to do. But in 1694, when Tew was sitting at Fletcher's table in New York and being paid the compliments of a successful man in a society that respected success, the consequences were still in the future. He was alive. He was rich. He was planning a second voyage, a merry life. The short part came the following year. The cannonball found him in the Arabian Sea on September 7th, 1695, and Thomas Tew, the Rhode Island pirate, the man who had opened the Indian Ocean to piracy and changed the world of the golden age of pirates forever, died with his hands pressed to a wound that no amount of money could close. The Amity sailed on without him. The pirate round sailed on without him. Henry Every sailed on without him and took the Ganges Sawai and walked away with 100 million pounds and was never caught. And Thomas Tew's bones are somewhere in the Arabian Sea, in water that has no record of them, in a grave that no one knows and no one marked, and that 3 centuries of tides and time and the specific indifference of deep water have kept completely. He is still there. The route he found is still there too, in the history books, in the accounts of every pirate who followed him east and found the same strait and the same ships and made the same calculation he made on the deck of a small sloop in the Atlantic when his original commission had fallen apart and he needed a new plan. He pointed east. He said, "Merry life and a short one." He was right on both counts. Follow him if you dare.